Okay guys, so I just thought I would show you kind of like what I'm going to be doing in this book for notes. Just kind of the general purpose of how I want you to kind of walk through the notebook and what I want you to kind of start looking at. So whenever I teach, I always teach lecture based, but then I always feel like I'm not leaving students with the information. So usually when I feel like this is how it's going to work. So typically how I already did this lesson is I talked about the supplies, and then I rewatched it back, and then I wrote the notes down. And that's what I did that with that previous watercolor class, and that's where I came up with this idea. So I rewatched the notes back, and that's where I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to kind of revisit the notes again and kind of just show you what I want you to do with it. And then when I start the next lesson, I'll show you, what I did with the previous notes and how pretty they are and everything else. And so just to kind of explain, this is like where I said that this was a series that I'm going to be starting. So this is kind of like your publisher notes. So it's a YouTube series. So this is my YouTube series. So you could put like the name of where you found it, the date that you started it, your experience level, what supplies, just certain things like that. And so that's kind of what you can start with, and you can keep adding your own personal little notes in on this page as you go on, or like when you finished, etc. So then I just made a title page. You don't have to do this. This isn't necessary, but I did a little time lapse, and I may show it later, but it will come into play with a mixed media class that we'll be doing later. So then, again, I rewatched the notes, and this is where you kind of learn as you go. Sometimes things don't go right the first time around. So I just forgive it, and I just let it be. So I started out doing this title page on the supplies, and I had already used quite a bit of paint on this side, so I had to use paint on this side because it was just a disaster. So I used paint, but then the Sharpie didn't work on top of it, and then I used paint on top of it, and it didn't really write very well. But anyway, needless to say, you learn as you go along. So again, just kind of like went from working with the Sharpie, and then I worked with this Uniball marker. I even used the Sharpie on this side, but then realized that the Sharpie bled through, so that's why there's paint on this side. From going forward, I'll just be using this Uniball and just the book, just so you know. So yeah, going back to the notes, again, just make pretty notes. They are your notes, so I want, and this is your textbook, so I want it to read the way that you would understand it. This is the way I understand it. I'm a very linear reader. I need to know that this is for this is for this, and this is for this. So I need things blocked off in certain ways. If you can be like, boom, here's a circle, here's like a circle, or if you need to write it out, however you need to write it out, it will make sense to you, and you will keep changing it as you go. And that is the point of this book. Is you will see your progress, and that is so important. So anyway, yeah, I just wanted to show you. So we talked about surface protection. So I put the suggestions of surface protection and why. I tried to do that for most of the items that I talked about. I think I kind of didn't talk about a few things, so I'm just going to kind of reiterate some of them again, just to make sure I hit all those points. So again, surface protection, just to make sure you protect your area, and tablecloth, old cloth, or towel, or rag, or something to protect your area. The one thing we didn't talk about in the video was a rag. You're going to need like a rag or paper towel. This is to get rid of the extra moisture or extra paint off of your paintbrush. Of course, I'm sure resources are kind of limited at this point. And even going out to the store is a little problematic. So let's just find an old t-shirt or something that is okay to use. We're okay with using this one. So this is an old t-shirt. So that's what I'll be using. So I just have that off to the side. And again, we talked about the water jar in the video. So again, remember, go cheap, just use whatever you have. Tabletop easel, I'm just gonna briefly talk about that for a minute. If you don't have a tabletop easel, you can always just kind of prop your canvas up by using some painter's tape or something underneath it, just so that way it's raised up. I'm going to try and see if I can do that, because it's really important to have your surface just elevated ever so slightly instead of flat, because it changes your perspective on how your shadows and everything are. So that is why it is important to have an easel. The one that I'm using, I got from a local art store. I don't even remember the brand of it. It's relatively cheap. It was like 20 bucks Canadian. And it does telescope out, so it does go to floor length. So I think it's like a multi-purpose and super cheap, and I've had these forever. So that's briefly about the tabletop easel that I missed. I think we talked about pretty good a conversation about the brushes, and again, I will talk about brushes in greater detail in a later lesson. I just did a cute little paintbrush. I'll show you how to do a paintbrush, draw a cute little paintbrush in the next video. So then I just wrote down my recommendations for later on in the course, because I did talk about that. I did a cute little paint palette, and I put paint trays and why we use them, and just a list of kind of examples like I talked about in the video as well. And then the canvas, as we talked about. And then here is for the paint. And then what I am going to do, and I haven't done it yet, but I am going to take little swatches of the paint that I have, and I'm going to put it right beside each of the colors. And that way I have a first-hand glance at knowing what colors I have available. For those of you who are just kind of getting supplies as you go along, you can kind of just start doing your paint little swatches, so then that way you can kind of start seeing what you need as a collection. So it's a good little resource for you, and you can always take this right to the art store with you too, so that's a good little note. And then I just listed the additional colors. So these are the primary ones we're going to be using to start off with. Then we're going to be adding these ones into the mix later on. Brush cleaner, we talked about that. Wrote that down. And then for additional supplies now, rather than just being completely boring and just handwriting them like this, I decided I was just gonna do a quick little drawing. Now that is just me, that is how I wanted to do it. I wanted to break it up in the notes. And if you're like, I can't draw, but I really want to do something cool, you know what, find some images in a catalog or something like that, take pictures of them, or print them out on your printer, and then just glue them in. This is meant to be fun. So those are just kind of some suggestions on how to kind of work into your notebook. I know I have this weird little gap here, but it doesn't have to end on every page. It's my book. So, maybe this might be something else that we come up with in a conversation later. So I can always leave that and come back to it. All right, so I hope that makes sense. And you can kind of see, like, I started to add some borders in here and borders in here. And I will be kind of like, keep going forward with this. I always kind of just pick it up whenever I'm kind of bored, and there's a lot of boredom going around lately. So it's a good thing to just kind of pick it up, and when you're bored, just keep the forward movement going. It'll keep your brain in kind of a nice little yoga state, and it just keeps it forward motion. So that is kind of your little bit of assignment for the first part of this lesson, is to come up with some really pretty notes and work on them. And then I will show you what I come up with in the next video, or what at least I have going on. Like I said, I always kind of keep going back and forth with it. So in the next lesson, we are going to get into talking about brushes. So I'll see you in the next lesson.